Now, is Labour going soft on Brexit? Joining me is Seb Dance MEP and Deputy Leader of Labour in Europe. Seb, let's put that to you. Obviously, this is in the context of Jeremy Corbyn's speech. Suddenly, a customs union arrangement post-Brexit could be a possibility, both, for government policy if they're defeating Westminster, but now for Labour policy. Is this part of a movement, a trajectory towards what is going to be a soft Brexit? By that I mean single market, customs union arrangement, March 2019?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, obviously during the referendum we said that being in the European Union is in the country's best interests, and after the referendum we said if we're not going to be in the EU, then being in the single market and customs union is in the United Kingdom's best interest. So I think that the speech is a huge step forward, certainly, but of course, in terms of government policy, the December agreement on phase one of the talks has effectively already put the United Kingdom in some sort of customs union arrangement with the EU for two reasons. Firstly, the all-island economy, which was always part of the deal and which the government's already signed up for. And I know you're going to ask me about this, but it's important for the first question. And the second reason, of course, that the DUP is saying that should apply east-west as well as north-south. So I'm very pleased that the Labour Party has put on record our support now for a customs union, and I hope that we can move forward and have a sensible discussion about what the real options are if we leave the EU.
Well, I mean, there is an element, though. Jeremy Corbyn, parliamentary record states he's very much a Eurosceptic. A customs union of some sort could be a possibility. Going full single market access and all the obligations you have of single market access as well. Is that really reasonable? Because you must know as much as I do, and many people sense, Jeremy Corbyn has always been a Eurosceptic.
I think he's certainly not as enthusiastic as I or many of my colleagues in the European Parliament are about the European project, but I campaigned with him, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 times throughout the referendum. He always gave very passionately pro-Remain speeches. He campaigned on the stump with us right up until referendum day. In fact, we went round, a huge group of us from Brussels, to his house on the day of the referendum and campaign in Islington, where incidentally we got a very positive result. So, this kind of, is he Eurosceptic, is he not? I think at the end of all of this, we have to look at what the options are. And is the customs union without the single market reasonable? Well, let's look at what it would mean. For example, Turkey is the most obvious example of a country that is not in the single market but is in a customs union with the European Union. There are frequently 10-mile queues on the border between Bulgaria and Turkey. The Turkish market is open to third countries that sign deals with the European Union, but the markets are not in turn open to Turkey because as a member state, it has to negotiate its own bilaterals, which is not in the third country's interest. So I'm afraid the customs union on its own will not be sufficient.
And you think that the Jeremy Corbyn will realise this? And do you expect somewhere down the line, wherever it might be, Jeremy Corbyn to do a similar speech and announce actually Labour understand it's important to stay in the single market as well alongside a customs union arrangement?
I hope so. I mean, we are all learning more and more about the European Union as we go through this process, and I include myself, even I. And I think we'd be hard-pressed 18 months ago to have picked anyone here to say what's the difference between the single market and the customs union.
Let's just talk very quickly about Labour in particular, because you are a London MEP, so it's relatively easy for you to stand on the ticket that you're standing on. There has been noticeable discontent from particularly some Labour heartland constituencies up in the north. Single market, customs union, well, certainly a customs union arrangement. Suddenly, Jeremy Corbyn is letting them down, is fudging Brexit on behalf. Do you think that's a problem, though, for Labour Party in terms of their members versus their electorate?
No, I haven't brought this for this meeting. This is for another meeting I'm about to have. But these are the government's own figures on what the impact of Brexit will be. They're not my figures. They're not some Guardianista Ramona compound that's come up with these. These are the government's own figures. And as you'll see, in the northeast, in the northwest, in Wales and in Northern Ireland, the effect of leaving the customs union and the single market is effectively the equivalent of several 2008 crashes, one after the other.
But what's there that everyone didn't know at the time they voted in the referendum? Surely everyone, they got the George Osborne Doomsday Treasury files which had the predictions, and they still voted Brexit.
But the George Osborne predictions weren't done by a civil service doing a robust impact assessment. I mean, this is what the civil service do. Whenever there's a new policy, whenever there's an idea, the civil service have to do an impact assessment. These figures from the government's own department charged with executing Brexit demonstrate very clearly that in all of the Brexit scenarios there is an economic hit. Now, these figures were never known. These figures were not made known before the referendum. This is what we know now. It's not what was known on the 23rd of June.
And that's going to win over the Labour heartlands who voted very strongly to leave.
It will certainly focus minds. So, for example, when I give a pro-European speech in London, as I have done with MPs from northern constituencies that voted leave, a lot of them say, you should make that speech up in X constituency. And I say to them, yes, I would love to. Because actually, nobody is making this case in the Labour heartlands that voted leave. Incidentally, the majority of Labour voters voted Remain. And that's important for people in seats that voted leave to remember. But these messages have to be told. The idea that we can have the same trade if we decide not to follow the same rules as everyone else is, of course, for the birds. And that will affect manufacturing, it will affect services, it will affect the jobs of hundreds and thousands of people in key areas that Labour represents.
What everyone wants to know now, we know now that Jeremy Corbyn, Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, supports a customs union arrangement. Can you tell us anything about what actually this customs union arrangement is going to be? Do you have any clarity here? Because we've gone from possibly a tactic of constructive ambiguity on the Labour Party's, fudging the Brexit policy as much as possible, to now ambiguity over what developing in a slow and gentle manner. But now we're on to a customs union. But there isn't much clarity on what this customs union looks like.
Well, there can't be until you've entered into discussions about what it would look like. So
it's a customs union, but you don't actually know what the customs union is, but you know it's good enough.
The conversation hasn't been started. So we're coming at this from a point of view where we don't rule out the options of having a customs union, because we acknowledge that that is the best way to have the free flow of goods and services for just-in-time manufacturing techniques, for example, that are a vital part of our manufacturing industry. But what I would say, and what you haven't heard so far perhaps from others, is that the rules that enable that free flow of goods will of course be decided in the main by the European Union. It's not as if we will be approaching that as equal negotiating partners, and that's something we have to recognise. And obviously at the moment we have a say over what those rules are, but when we leave we won't.
So you know that there will be no effort to cherry pick any kind of customs arrangement. That will not be on the Labour Party's agenda when negotiating a customs union.
I'm sure whenever you're starting from a position of relative weakness as the UK is, there will be requests to do that, but I think I'm being realistic in saying it won't fly. I mean, it's been said again and again and again and again by the Commission, by other members of this Parliament, by the national governments, even by some regional governments, and by industry associations in countries that we would want to have.
But not really said by Jeremy Corbyn in his speech on Monday, though. He wasn't as realistic as that. And I'll just to pivot onto this other point, you were obviously infamous for putting a sign up behind Nigel Farage saying he's lying. Yeah, well, I'll say infamous, generously saying infamous. The question the question for Jeremy Corbyn, is he stood up and said a customs union on Monday. Slightly ambiguous. Was not as realistic as you were then in saying we will not be going as equal partners. Is he not necessarily in a sinister way, but is he to some extent lying about what he's actually trying to achieve?
No. So there's a lot of talk about in a customs union, in the customs union. It is technically correct that you can't be in the customs union if you leave the European Union. You would have to be in a customs union. But it is also correct to say that that customs union would be a replication. But we wouldn't have the advantages of having other countries' markets open to our goods and services. And here's an example. If there were, God forbid, another TTIP, right? That would effectively open up the UK's market to the US market, so they could flood our market with their products, but we wouldn't be able to do so in return. And the only way we would be able to do so in return is to have a separate bilateral with the United States, which of course it would not be in their interest to have.
And so Jeremy Corbyn is basically selling, as his party policy, a worse version of the current customs.
No, because if you look at where our manufacturing is based, all of our, the vast majority of our exports and our supply chains are within the single market. So having a customs union with the EU is essential as a first step. The point I'm making is it's not enough, because if the EU, as it will negotiate further trade deals with other parts of the world, in order to benefit from that fully, we have to have a say here, and I'm afraid they're not going to give a say to a non-member state.
And so it is going to be a worse situation.
Of course. Brexit is a worse situation. There's no way around it. We can't pretend that you can somehow Brexit and have a better situation. Brexit will make our economy worse.
But that's the ticket that Jeremy Corbyn's standing. That's his vision. His vision post-Brexit is for a worse situation.
We have a principle in the Labour Party of respecting the vote, and I understand it, and I respect that. However, my view is that in order to avoid economic harm, you can't respect the vote. So at some point, this conflict will have to be resolved. But what the Labour Party is doing, whilst respecting the vote, is saying we will do everything we can to minimise the damage.
Seb Dance, thank you very much.
Thank you.